Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace. Hello, and welcome to another episode of GeoSpace. I'm your host, Mohammed Salih, and this is the New Regions Biweekly podcast, where we move beyond the noise of daily headlines to examine the deeper political, security, and geopolitical currents shaping the Middle East. Today, we turn our focus to Syria and the increasingly precarious situation facing ethnic and religious minorities there. In January, Syria's new army, alongside allied tribal militias, launched a major campaign against the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF. Much of the territory previously under SDF control has since fallen to the government of President Ahmed al with Damascus now reasserting authority over most of the country. Serious questions arise about what this means for Kurds, Druze, Christians, Yazidis, and others. Tensions are already visible in Druze majority Suwaida in the south, where a February 7 attack by government forces reportedly left at least four Druze civilians killed. Yet, Syria's geopolitical landscape remains complex, and any large-scale move against the Druze risks throwing Israel directly into the equation. To unpack all of this, I'm joined today by Nadine Maenza. Nadine is a leading advocate for international religious freedom and currently serves as co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable in Washington and chair of the Institute for Global Engagement, and also serves as an advisor to the Shai Fund. She previously served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, including as chair. Nadine has traveled extensively across Syria and Iraq, engaging communities on the ground and advising policymakers on inclusive governance and minority protection. Before we get started, a quick reminder, you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch tab, as well as on YouTube and SoundCloud. For broader regional coverage, including our latest reporting on Syria, visit thenewregion.com. Nadine, welcome to GeoSpace.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. You have been deeply engaged on Syria for years, but especially over the past few weeks with the IRF Summit, the International Religious Freedom Summit, and your congressional testimony recently. Do you sense any meaningful shift in Washington's attitude towards Syria, President Shara, and the minority question, especially after the attack on the SDF and Kurds in the Northeast?
Oh, certainly. I think the fact that the House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing seemed to have a lot of the both Democrats and Republican members showing their concern for the minority communities, showing their concern that the Northeast was taken by force. There seemed to be a unanimous agreement that even by those who were giving testimony that there has been some problems with crimes against these communities and that this isn't a good policy long term for Syria. So I do think there is now an awareness that is going to put pressure on this government, hopefully to make some changes in the security forces and also in their policies towards minorities.
Right. Let's zoom in on the realities on the ground. From your conversations and travels, how would you describe the current conditions for minorities inside Syria today? Let's say especially compared to a year ago.
Yeah, I think that minorities are, of course, are not a monolith. So there's going to be ones that feel safer, ones that are more afraid. But I think the sense on the ground is, there's been a lot of violence against minority communities. And of course, ISIS attacked a Christian church. So there was the chaos that gave space really for extremism to rise in general. And then, of course, the Constitution being released and not being inclusive, and elections not really having very many minorities or women win seats in parliament. So I think there's been a lot of signs that there isn't that equal citizenship that minority communities want, not just for themselves, they want for everybody. And so depending on where they live, how safe they feel, that also is a big part of it. I feel like sometimes the ones closer in Damascus and those areas are more nervous than some of them that are maybe in the mountains that are less around some of the threats or have not really seen them as much.
Let's talk a little bit about the situation in the Northeast. Up until, a month or two ago, northeastern Syria, the areas under the Syrian Democratic Forces control was, usually held up as an example of religious and ethnic coexistence in the country. It doesn't mean, it didn't have problems. It had some, serious problems, but it was typically seen as a place where different groups could coexist, different religious and ethnic groups. Now, with the Damascus government expanding its authority to the northeast, how is the situation for the minorities they're going to be? Are they feeling, safer, or are they feeling threatened as a result of the recent expansion of the Damascus government's authority to the previously SDF administered areas of the Northeast?
Oh, I believe the minority communities most of them are afraid or of what the Northeast may look like. There's a real hope that this integration deal works because the way the integration deal with the Syrian government was set up, it would keep that local security and local governance that really did transform the religious freedom conditions in northeast Syria. So if they're able to keep these Syrian security forces outside of these minority villages, then we're going to be able to see that safety continue for these communities. I think they're afraid of these security forces coming in and committing the kind of atrocities that we've seen in the Alawite areas, the Druze areas, and then, of course, coming in as they took the Northeast by force against some of the Kurdish fighters and the Kurdish community, the families that they ran into.
Right. And speaking of minorities, they're typically lumped together. But we also know, that not all of them face the same degrees of threat, maybe, and that they're also not monolithic, like each community within its own ranks. So, which minority community would you say is now most at risk in Syria, like Yazidis, Alawites, Kurds, Christians, or the Druze, or others?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. I do think the Yazidis are at special risk because ISIS, of course, target them the most. So they clearly have a history where they are the first ones Islamists will target. I think some of the Kurdish Christian converts who've been very public about their faith and the churches that have been very public because of the safety they've had could also be threatened in a special way because of the Islamist view of them being apostates. And so I think that those are two in the Northeast I'm most concerned about, and why one of the reasons it's so important that the integration deal keeps the Syrian security forces out and just keeps the local security and the local governance in those areas. But of course, that Alawites, the Druze, are still at risk. We see Suwaida having even a harder clampdown over this last weekend with them not allowing anyone to enter Soweto. You could leave, but you can't come in. And so some of these things are showing that there could be other areas that could be targets. Of course, we've seen during the protests of the Alawites not long ago, there was some live shots fired into the crowds. And so there's still, and of course, a bombing at a mosque in an Alawite area. So we've seen crimes continue against these communities. So all of them have a certain level of fear. But I think in the Northeast, those minority communities are probably the most at risk.
Right. Speaking of the Druze, and given what we saw, the deadly incident on February 7th, like, do you get a sense that the Syrian government might be actually emboldened as a result of its successful campaign against the SDF, thinking that now was perhaps, more of an opportune moment for them to, to go in and try to take over Sueda as well? Or do you think because of the Israeli involvement in this equation, it's going to be really different from the Northeast?
I think because of the outcry against their operation against the Northeast, both by Congress and in the international community. I would be surprised if they would make a move like that on Sweden right now. I think another military operation against the minority community would could really change the policy in the international community against this government. So I'm hopeful that that won't be something that they'll do. But it's hard to know how they're making the calculations to take the steps they're taking.
Right. If we, this is something that I've been thinking about. If you look at how Turkey, for example, has conducted its military operations inside Syria, they have followed a phased strategy.
Yeah.
Like, they had the concerns about the Kurds in northeast Syria and the YPG, the People's Protection Forces or units, which were the nucleus of the SDF later. The Turkish military didn't go all in, to take over all the Kurdish controlled areas in one go. They first started in 2015 with Azaz and Al-Bab area in Aleppo province. At some point later, they, in 2018, took over Afrin, and later, other parts of the northeast. And after the fall of the Assad regime, they encouraged Syrian armed factions affiliated with Turkey to go and take over Manbij. And now they have taken over all the areas west of Euphrates, the Syrian military, that is, with the encouragement of Turkey, and large parts of, SDF controlled areas east of the Euphrates River. It doesn't, I mean, it seems to me, that they are aware of the international reaction. They got a major backlash in 2019 as well when they tried to, take over parts of the SDF controlled territory. They got a considerable amount of reaction also this time. Also in July with the Druze. My question is basically, isn't the Syrian military with Turkey's backing going to, sort of adapt this phase strategy as well, and, like take over a portion of the territory at a time and not really, run the risk of having a major international backlash, and thinking or hoping, that that phased strategy is going to work out both, but in the best way for them, and that they could possibly reassert their authority over the entire country within a few years. They don't have to do it in the next couple of months.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And what they have wanted to do is, like you said, just phase and take areas. There's a little bit of complaints, but no one throws, no government threatens them. It doesn't, there's not a huge cost. And so they just keep repeating those actions. But I do think going into the Northeast the way they did, committing the crimes against the minority communities, the videos of them killing the Kurdish fighter, the women, and really was there was an outcry that I haven't seen so far yet. And I don't think it was so much that it was just the Kurds. I think it was a culmination of, now we've seen three of these attacks against minority communities, the Alawites, then Druze, and now the Kurds. And so while there's been some fear that this integration agreement wouldn't be implemented fairly because none of them have so far, and every agreement the Syrian government has made with the SDF has not been kept. So why would this one be kept? And of course, the consequence for this one is huge because it keeps these Syrian security forces out of minority villages. So I think that's why it's so important that the international community is putting pressure on this government, that they're also paying close attention to what's happening on the ground. So they can't do another phased strategy where they make a deal with the Northeast. The international community kind of is happy about the deal, so they look away and they start paying attention to other things. And then in a month, they just move into these villages and take it all over. And instead of asking for permission, they ask for forgiveness and they get it again, and then they just move on to the next. So I do think that that's probably the strategy, unfortunately, if we're not going to stand up and say that's not acceptable. I think we've all seen, the Secretary of State Rubio sitting at the Munich Security event today with both Shabani as well as General Mazloum Ilham Ahmed. I think that sends a message that, if we're going to talk about all of Syria, we have to have them at the table. And that sends a huge message that they matter to the United States. They matter to the international community. And they matter for the future of Syria. If you want a Syria for all Syrians, you have to include all of these religious and ethnic minority communities to be equal citizens in Syria. And so I do think that the pressure is a good thing, and I'm hoping it will stop that phase strategy that they've been implementing so far.
Right. You brought up the Munich Security Conference and the participation of the SDF chief, General Mazloum Abdi, and the head of foreign relations for the Syrian Democratic Council, Ilham Ahmed, alongside the Syrian government delegation headed by Foreign Minister Asad al-Shaybani. That's a really very interesting development. Do you have any, information or idea what brought this about? Like, was there any sort of behind the scene push for this to happen, to sort of give this image or impression of a unified Syria in a way?
Yeah, I did hear about this a couple of days ago, and I was encouraged to hear that they would be attending this conference. And I know logistically it's a difficult thing to get out of Northeast Syria for an event like this. So there had to be a lot of people involved, governments in supporting this travel. So I'm not exactly sure how the U.S. played a role, but for Secretary of State Marco Rubio to be sitting at this table and having a role in this, he's somebody that knows Syria very well. He was key to even lifting sanctions on Northeast Syria in May of 2022, a letter that he did along with the Democratic Senate chair of the committee at the time. Um, was key for U.S. policy softening towards Northeast Syria. So Secretary Rubio for him to want them at the table with him sends an important message that the United States is acknowledging their important part of Syria.
Right. Let's go back to the, case of the minority groups and specifically the situation with the Christians in Syria. There's a narrative, that they are being showcased by the Shia government as, proof of some sort of pluralism and religious tolerance. Do you think that Christians are genuinely protected in the post-Assad Syria and under, the Shia government? Or, are they at risk of becoming some sort of a PR instrument by the government while not actually enjoying, the benefits of first-class citizenship or even, security protection, given what we saw, with the attack on the church recently?
It's a very difficult position for these Christian leaders to be in Syria right now. There's so many patriarchs and leaders of entire churches that are based in Damascus. And, their first priority is going to be their own parishioners, the people that attend their church to provide safety for them. So I think it's important that we not put them in a position where we're asking them to either explain away the crimes of this government or to take on the government directly. Uh, it's an unfair position for them to be in. So I think it's important that we allow them to have the space to be able to focus on their congregations. And some of them are going to say positive things about this government. Some of them are going to say negative things about the government. But for us to understand that they have a different priority, there hasn't been political space in Syria for decades for people to be able to be opposition, to be able to speak against a government. In Northeast Syria, there was a ton of that. I mean, you would see that all the time where people, whether join a political party that was against the autonomous administration, and they would speak openly about that. And sometimes people would say to me, yeah, but this group's against them or that group's against them. And I try to explain that's a good thing. I mean, in America, we
Right.
always have 45% of Americans don't support the president. Like the fact that they created space where they could politically fight was so important, and it allowed people to have those robust discussions about policy. And I think that we can't expect Christians to step into that space and do that in Syria at this moment because they don't know what the government's going to look like. They don't know that if they're going to be targeted. Obviously, the chaos has created a space where ISIS has already targeted them. And I do know plenty of them I've spoken to have told me they either personally or their churches have been threatened. So there is a sense of fear from those kinds of threats that have gone on. But again, Christians are not a monolith either. Some of them feel safer than others depending on where they live and their relationships. But I think it's important that the international community not put them in the spotlight and not demand anything of them other than for them to figure out how to care for their own communities. And right now, the economic situation is so dire that really feeding their communities, getting the medical care, helping them to recover from decades of this horrific Assad family rule is so important. And I know I've been able to be a part of the Shy Fund in helping to support some of the humanitarian support for some of the villages and both in the regime areas and in the Northeast. And those are the kind of things we could do to support this community without expecting them to be at put themselves at risk with political speech.
Right. It's also, important to note that the numbers of the Christian community in Syria has been really, reduced compared to the pre-2011 number that we had. So the figure is estimated to have dwindled from about 2 million to somewhere around half a million to 600, 700,000 in the country. It's also a major thing that distinguishes the Christian situation from other groups like the Druze, Alawites, or the Kurds is that they do not have a major geographical concentration in terms of territory in any part of the country. So they are more dispersed in the metro areas, Damascus, Aleppo, portions in the northeast. So I think that also really affects how the Christian community, given also its different religious denominations, behaves or what kind of grievances and political demands, it articulates vis-a-vis Damascus. Another thing which is really very important, and I know you have been following this, and you were also recently yourself a target of this, is the rise of, hate speech in Syria,
Yeah.
which is, very, very concerning for anyone who pays close attention to the situation in the country, because you have a reality where, on the one side, you have military campaigns conducted against different religious and ethnic groups by the government and, tribal militias allied with them. And then on the other hand, you have this, just explosion of hate and dehumanization vis-a-vis these groups on the social media platforms in particular, but also on, on Syrian state media. And unfortunately, some of the prominent pan-Arab media outlets in the Gulf have also, provided space for that sort of rhetoric or incitement against minorities. I'll just give you one example. There this famous Syrian cartoonist Ali Farzad, who won the Sakharov Prize, which is given by the European Parliament to prominent defenders of freedom of speech, to prominent political dissidents. And he came out during the, government campaign, recent military campaign in Aleppo against Kurds by, drawing. It wasn't a drawing, it was more of a montage of an image with very strong and explicit sexual suggestions against a dead Kurdish female fighter.
Mhm.
And I think, the reason why it is important is when someone of that, stature actually feels it's okay to come out and do something like this, I think it speaks to the depth of the greater problem, that we are facing in Syria. So, what does this outpouring of, in a way, societal hatred tell us about where Syria is headed, at the moment, and the kind of future that minorities, should or could expect in this country if, mm, you know, large segments of the majority population or significant sections of the majority Sunni Arab population does not really accept them.
Yeah, the hate speech in Syria against the minority communities, especially like you said, the Kurds at this moment, and right before they went into the Northeast, is stunning and so dangerous. The one thing we've learned about hate speech throughout the world and the different parts of the world where we're seeing conflict among religious and ethnic communities is you can't control hate. And we've seen this time and time again where leaders think, they could grow hate against a community and use it to their own advantage and then wield it when they want to do what they want to do, but it doesn't work that way. It just takes on a life of its own and it kind of destroys everything in its path. We saw this with Al Qaeda. Even Osama bin Laden himself wrote letters to try to get some of the Al Qaeda chapters to stop targeting Muslim communities because it had made him a pariah. He'd always wanted Al Qaeda to be targeting the US and Israel, and instead they targeted moderate Muslims as well, and maybe even more so. And that wasn't his point in establishing Al Qaeda. And so it's a great example of the danger of what happens when hate grows like this. So how do we bring the temperature down in Syria against minority communities? Because it's going to be hard to build that social cohesion, to be able to have that unified Syria that everyone keeps talking about. If people believe this about their neighbors, and have hate against them, and that's I'm certain led to some of the horrific crimes we saw as these forces entered the Northeast. They entered the Northeast with a lot of hate against them.
Right. In terms of the, political future or the political deal that the minorities can now expect in Syria. So, we know that the Syrian, transitional or interim constitution as is really, concentrates power in the hands of the president. It's basically a formula for a highly centralized system with the president, at the central figure in a way that is not really different from what it used to be under the Assad regime. And, the minority communities in the country have also been calling for some degree of decentralization. That is what the Kurds have been asking for. The Druze seem now to have even crossed that line, and many of them want an independent Druze state. And we hear those kind of demands and aspirations also being voiced by the Alawites and their representatives. So, given what we have on the ground in the country, are these demands for decentralized rule really compatible with the framework of a centralized Syrian state in the way that President Shara and his backers in Turkey and the Gulf, or even some in Washington, have in mind for the country?
I think that is why this integration agreement in Northeast Syria is so crucial that the international community press that it holds, because it does give a certain level of decentralization in the sense that local communities could have local police and local leaders. Now, that sounds so simple to us in the West, who most of us have a mayor that lives in our community and also has policemen from our own community. But in Syria, that is not how al-Shara has set this government up, and it wasn't the way that Assad did either. Assad, of course, had his own people be mayors and his own people be security, and often from his own village. And we're seeing this in most of Syria. The mayors have been from Idlib or HTS, and most of the security forces that are doing checkpoints and that provide security for these local communities are the same. And that is not a long-term answer to building the kind of Syria that when President al-Shara speaks about Syria it sounds like he wants, which is one where everyone has a stake in their own future, that everyone can pour themselves into rebuilding Syria. That is what it's going to take to be able to recover from all they have experienced under Assad, and now with the bumpy transition and the violence with the minority communities. If they're going to move forward to this unified, safe, and secure Syria, they're going to need every member of society to be able to pour into their own country, to be able to be a part of leading and striving for that peace and stability. And right now, a lot of people in their community have someone from outside making all the decisions for them. They're not feeling they're a part of it. And I think that that's partly why so many minorities want to leave, is they see this and they're like, there's no role for us in this country anymore. And I think President al-Shara could really do a lot for these communities by bringing them in, letting them be a part of their own security, their own governance, just like in the Northeast, making sure that deal holds. And he would gained so much legitimacy with these groups and the moderate Sunnis that also want that for their country. So if he really wants to have the ability to rule Syria in a way that moves them forward, he's going to need to build that legitimacy with the people. Having it from that's just the international community isn't enough. And this is how he can do it. So I mean, when I talk about what I want for Syria, it's not a takedown of this government. I actually want instead for cover for them to be able to move forward with some of these inclusive policies that actually are the key to building long-term peace and stability.
Right. You raised a very important point about, members of these minority communities leaving the country.
Mhm.
Given what, sort of the total picture in front of us, what we are seeing in Syria today with a, highly centralized system of rule and government, and also the military campaigns organized by the government every now and then targeting a particular, minority community, as well as, the terrorist attacks and the abductions and killing that are conducted, by groups such as ISIS or others or rogue elements within the, Syrian security forces or, tribal elements and gangs. Do you think, the when looking at the totality of this picture, does it sort of is it I don't want to say design because not every aspect of this is necessarily designed, by one circle, but the totality of this picture, is it likely to actually lead to an exodus of the minorities over time from the country and creating a more homogeneous Syria that even if the intent on the part of the authorities is not exactly that, but the outcome is going to be, that sort of mass exodus and departure by the minorities.
I do believe that this is an environment that is going to lead to many minorities leaving unless there's a change. And I'll be honest, I've spoken to plenty in the Sunni community that also want to leave. They're not sure there's a role for their children to grow up in an inclusive society. You know, if they're well educated and well traveled, then they see what's happening. Some of them are fearful of a community of Syria having this extremist ideology grow, and they don't want to have their own families be a part of that either. So that is partly, I think, why the House Foreign Affairs Committee was so concerned about Syria and having this hearing right now about challenges to U.S. policy because of the impact, not just it has on communities in terms of violence, but also pushing them out of Syria. And of course, we talk about, one of the world's oldest Christian communities. And I say one of the world's newest Christian communities, because you have, of course, the old churches and, on the road to Damascus. And then you have all these converts that are the newest members of the Christian community. So you have this really full Christian community in Syria and they want to stay. They just need jobs and security. That's what they've told me over and over again for them to be able to stay and want to be a part of Syria right now. We have one minister that's a Christian. But when you see a room of decision makers on whenever you see the president, he's usually with a lot of Sunni men. And that seems to be almost the entire room is usually Sunni men that doesn't represent the robust religious communities that Syria has had for such a long time, and it could really strengthen Syria if he did build that inclusive government that he's really promised. He said verbally to many of the minority groups, we're gonna have an inclusive Syria, but we just haven't seen it yet. He, of course, is going to be making appointments for the I think 70 members of parliament. I mean, he certainly has an opportunity to bring in a lot of minorities, a lot of women. I think we're going to be watching that closely, and that will signal if he's serious about building this inclusive government or not. I mean, there's been talk about changes to the Constitution, obviously, to add Kurdish rights. But if they can make some of these recommendations that many scholars have made, again, that will signal to the international community and to his own people that he wants to build an inclusive Syria. And maybe people will reconsider and they'll set up that home business or that they'll invest in their own community and try to rebuild rather than save money to try to leave the country.
Right. I think, as you mentioned, the remaining members of the Syrian parliament, the appointment of those members would be really an important test, given what has happened. And, given the fact that some of the people close to the government were describing the fact, that that number has been left unappointed so far. to be, to be sort of used as a corrective measure in case if the representation in the election that happened, which were also criticized very extensively, that this remaining group of individuals would be basically appointed or selected in a way to create some sort of balance or be a corrective step. So it would be interesting to see what kind of people, would be chosen and what that really also means, given the criticism in the past of the president's conduct and his vision for the country in light of everything that has happened. Let's get to the, regional actors that are playing a role in shaping the reality on the ground in Syria today. We have Turkey, we have Israel, we have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and to a far lesser extent, the UAE, which is more interested in the commercial aspects of what is happening, really, and not playing a role in shaping the politics as much. How do you see, these regional interests intersect with and shape, the future or the fate of the minorities on the ground in Syria? Is the interest of these regional actors in Syria good for the minorities or bad?
Well, when you look at these countries, human rights is not a top priority for them in their own countries. So, of course, we're not going to see that be a priority for them in Syria. But I think what's different about Syria, to say Saudi Arabia, Syria is such a diverse country with a history of a tapestry of religious and ethnic minorities. And that to have a peaceful Syria that will be a good investment for your dollars, it makes a lot of sense for there to be some social cohesion among all of these communities so they can live together peacefully. So if you're an investor in one of these countries, whether an investor or a private business or public business, you're not going to want to be pouring money that's just going to disappear. You're going to be wanting to make money back. And so I think that that's something this government needs to reconsider as Caesar sanctions were lifted, that Caesar sanctions weren't everything, that peace and stability is good for business, and that these countries are coming in for their own interests. But most of them are not going to want to just throw good money away at bad. So if they see money that's actually not helping, they're not going to want to keep putting money into it. So there's a good reason that even if the Syrian government wants these countries to continue to invest, they're going to need to provide a more stable investment opportunity.
Right. You're someone, Nadine, who is very well traveled, both inside Syria and the
Mhm.
region. And you are in constant, contact with the, representatives of various communities in the country, especially the minorities. What can you tell us, in terms of how the minorities in Syria really understand and view the role of Turkey, which seems to have, a very prominent role in terms of shaping the trajectory of events in Syria, and it is, it is not an exaggeration to say it is the foreign or the external actor with most influence in shaping Syrian affairs militarily and politically. How do minorities view this Turkish role in, in post-Assad Syria?
Well, Turkey has been a negative player in Syria for a while now, and so those minorities that have more experience by being targeted by the Syrian National Army, the Turkish-backed militias, are ones that are terrified at a growing Turkish role in the country. I know that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, um, 2025 annual report said that Turkish-backed forces, quote, terrorize Kurds and religious minorities with extortion, detention, and tortures. Their previous report said the same Turkish-backed militias continue to target religious minorities, especially Yazidis, for rape, assassination, kidnapping for ransom, confiscation of property, and desecration of cemeteries and places of worship. So if that's what Turkey does in the areas that they control, having their control widened into Syria is chilling for a lot of the minorities that have seen what they have done in the northern part of the country. So, Erdogan has democratic constraints in Turkey that he doesn't have in Syria. So that is why you're going to see conditions in Afrin in particular among the worst in all of Syria, with crimes against Yazidis, Christians, and others that are up there. Their land have been taken. Some of these militia leaders from there that have been sanctioned by the United States for horrific crimes, including the killing of Kurdish politician Hevrin Khalif, the holding of sex trafficking of Yazidis, and also making huge amounts of money off the land that they've taken from minorities that had olive trees and that were for other agricultural products that now they're making all the money from. So Turkey is shown to be very self-interested in Syria, and most of the minorities that in the ground are terrified of them. Some in the diaspora, of course, were part of the Syrian opposition, right? So you'll have Christians and others that were part of the Syrian opposition that has a different view of Turkey. And so when the diaspora speaks loudly or attacks me, for instance, or anyone else that speaks for those on the ground, they have very different goals than the people that live in the country. But those on the ground in the country most don't look at Turkey as being a positive player for Syria.
Right. And speaking of Turkey's role and its sensitivity toward the Kurds in particular in Turkey, inside Syria, is in light of what we have seen recently, the military campaign into the northeast, the expansion of the state authority there, is Rojava, the Kurdish majority parts and the political experiment tied to it over now? Or, do Kurds still have some sort of, can have some sort of realistic hope really for a measure of self-administration in places such as Hasaka and Kobani, or even in Afrin at some point down the road?
It's a really good question. I hope that they will have some control, and I hope that it will set the tone for other areas, maybe in Soweto and other places that are vulnerable, that it will be difficult to have these Syrian security forces come in and be a part of any sort of role in those communities because of the violence they've committed against them, to have local security and local governance. I think that that is part of why the US and the international community has a press for this integration agreement to work, because it could give them that possibility to have some sort of say into their future. And I think today, even recently seen General Mazloum and Ilham Ahmed sitting with Secretary Rubio and Foreign Minister Shabani at the same table kind of shows that maybe there's a role for these Kurdish leaders. I mean, what I always wanted was the Northeast to integrate in peacefully, and for these leaders to come into Damascus and share how they had helped build social cohesion, and then to have the people in the Northeast be a part of their own governance, maybe bring that into some of the other vulnerable areas. So it's such a disappointment to see how they were conquered by force that didn't have to happen, because they were trying to negotiate an answer. And of course, the Syrian government just decided time was up, and of course, with the backing of Turkey and others, went in to the Northeast. So it's hard to say what this will look like. And I think the US and the international community has a big say in that. And if they continue with pressure, we could see a better outcome. And if they don't, my fear is that the Syrian government will just go in and take over, and it will be over.
Right. Well, I agree with you. And the reason I asked that question is, if you look online, a lot of people seem to have written obituaries for the SDF and, Rojava and, the Kurdish political experiment in Syria, which I think is premature to say. But, regardless of to what extent that model of Kurdish self-rule is going to, persist and continue in Syria or not, what, if anything, could Shara's government or New Syria really learn from SDF's autonomous governance model in Northeast Syria when it comes to minority inclusion and coexistence? And
Well,
yeah, yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was part of an event in August that brought together religious communities that the government supported, and was very happy to have. Some of them came, and of course, it drew a congressional delegation with Senator Shaheen and Representative Joe Wilson, and of course, Ambassador Barrett came to the opening. And it's wonderful to get religious leaders together and members of the religious communities together. But the way in the Northeast they did it is because local communities built these communes, these local government where they would build, committees, have co-chairman, vice chairman that were men and a woman, different ethnicities and religions. So they all sat together and solved their own problems, long-term dialogue with each other as they did this. That kind of governance where people can sit at the table with each other, have robust conversations about things like roads and electricity and just all the governance stuff that local communities deal with, that actually builds social cohesion to have people of different religions sitting next to each other and making decisions and arguing about what the future should look like for their own community. That is how they built that social cohesion in the Northeast. When people say it was because this one leader said this or this one leader said that, that isn't what actually rebuilds relationships on the grassroots level. So we always say that Northeast Syria is like a religious freedom roundtable at every level of government because every level of government was then bringing together all the religious and ethnic communities and having, in fact, they overrepresented them. In an 80% Kurdish area, you'd still have a council that would be half minorities and half women, right? So you would see this robust conversation among all of the religious and ethnic communities, and they started seeing each other as equal. They started working together, building those relationships, and then you're seeing this kind of cohesion that was stunning, which is why we had such amazing religious freedom conditions in the Northeast. And I might add that I learned about the religious freedom conditions in the Northeast from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom as I joined, because they'd already been covering it for years. So any idea that I'm the one that informed USURF about the conditions in the Northeast, I didn't. I learned about it from them and then was able to go see for myself. They could have this kind of experiment in different ways throughout the country where they bring together local communities and they speak into local governance. It's not a threat to the President al-Shar. It's not a threat to any sort of leader. It actually, if anything, gives legitimacy to the government to bring people in, let them solve their own problems, rather than have it top down, authoritarian, where decisions are being made by the outsiders on you. That's People are tired of that after so many years under Assad. They want a say in their own governance. And that's what they did in the Northeast that worked. And it could still work in the Northeast, but it could also work in other parts of the country and it could benefit the whole country by helping to rebuild, especially with all this hate speech and all the division among the different religious and ethnic communities. It could really help rebuild.
Right. And I think apart, from that question of minority representation at different levels of government, the question of cultural and linguistic rights is also really important. And if followed the SDF-tied autonomous administration in Northeast Syria, they had three languages, like on, government buildings, on logos, on signs, Kurdish, Arabic, and Syriac, which is the local language spoken by the, various Christian communities and is a derivative of ancient Aramaic. So that really also goes to show, that having such forms of cultural recognition, linguistic recognition, and integration of them into everyday life is not going to bring down, a political entity, right? It's going to strengthen it because it really makes people, see their core aspects of identity being respected in within that polity and that political entity. Let's, in the remaining time that we have, get to the U.S. role in shaping what is happening in Syria. So, a lot of people didn't expect that new Syria will be embraced in the way that it has been by Washington. But President Trump, has given generously an opportunity to the Syrian government to rebuild, despite objections from people, toward the leader of Syria or the main group in charge, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Uh, is this campaign, or the different campaigns against minorities, military campaign that we have seen conducted by the Syrian government, is this like a misreading or even a misuse or abuse of the trust of the mandate that was given by Washington to Damascus?
The US could have helped them develop in a way that included their religious and ethnic minorities had there been some sort of guardrails, had there been some sort of uh, um, set of rules for how they treated religious ethnic minorities. This was why Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And this was to elevate religious freedom in foreign policy so that when decisions were being made about foreign policy for countries, that they would consider the impact on religious freedom, the impact on social cohesion for that country. Sometimes US policy can be very short term in the sense of what their goals are. Because we're a democracy, because we're looking for political wins, often it's a bipartisan problem. The president's looking for a political win in a country, but the long-term cost of that political win is not good for the minorities in that country because it actually ends up causing more stress and more violence against them because it deepens the divides between the religious and ethnic communities. We saw this in Iraq with some of the US policies that we made that actually divided religious and ethnic communities up by religious and ethnic communities and by sect. And that actually ended up leading to so many Christians leaving before we even, ISIS even came. There was 1.5 million Christians in 2003 in Iraq. And by the time ISIS came, there's only 700,000 left. And now there's only what, a little over 100,000 maybe. So the same thing could be true in Syria is to the US at this point in time, now that I think there's been a moment where they're reassessing policy for Syria, to have some guardrails. And part of this is to give cover to President al-Shara. If he does want to build an inclusive government, we know he's getting a ton of pressure from the Islamist base. We've seen this on social media. We've seen even an uprising by foreign fighters in Idlib. They kind of expected an Islamist state and they didn't get that. So in that respect, the president is pushed back to not deliver that. But that's a lot of pressure on his government, especially if they're in the security forces. And so the US government needs to be pressing for certain reforms to build an inclusive government, to have protection for the minorities, to include them in governance, and I think to make sure this deal in the Northeast holds. It could mean the difference between success and not success in Syria. It could mean the difference between peace long term and not having peace. So they might sound like small things. Oh, it's just a constitution, or oh, it's just the Northeast, who's going to provide security. But they're huge things. They signal to the entire country the way the country's moving. And they also signal to the minorities that live there that they belong and that this is their country too. And that they'll want to stay and invest in their country, or they'll save their money and they'll leave. Those are really what we're seeing right now, these options before this government, before the United States. I think it's pretty clear the steps that the United States needs to take in order to support a new Syria for all Syrians. Um, but there may not be a short-term political win in this, but it's more of a long-term investment. I think we need to look at Syria in more of a long-term way.
Right. In terms of those steps, so we recently had in January Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal, introduced this Save the Kurds Act. Is there any chance, that the Congress with this could be signaling more of an intent to actually take, measures in terms of the protection of minorities, and maybe, this kind of bill being seriously pursued in the Senate and later the House, and even broadened to include, the entire minority communities in Syria?
Yeah, so this bill was very important, and it signaled frustration with U.S. policy from Republicans like Lindsey Graham. They're very supportive of the president. So this bill is huge in that respect. It does take a long time for legislation to move in Washington, and I think people expected this to move within a few weeks. But as you know, lifting sanctions took all year to get the bill passed to lift sanctions. Most of the time, sanctions, what this bill does, could be done by the president in one day. So I think this was more of a messaging bill to the administration to say we're unhappy and we want sanctions on this government if they're not going to protect minorities and if they're not going to protect the Kurds in particular. And so, of course, it could pass. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to get a bill in the House, for there to be sponsors on both sides, and to have the kind of discussions and hearings they need to pass legislation. But I think the more important thing is it signaled to everyone that there was a problem, and that if most Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill also agree that there's a problem, as our House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on Tuesday, that was shockingly in unison. I had expected a little bit more pushback, or there to be some even debates among the panelists, but there really was not. There was a uniform understanding that there has been unaccepted level of violence against minority communities, and it was unacceptable that they took the Northeast by force. And they even showed a video of Kurdish women fighters being killed that was just stunning to people. You could just hear the silence in the room when it was shown, and the reality of the human cost of these policies, I think, hit really hard at this hearing, and that is, if especially for those members who had been to Syria, who had met with President al-Shara, like Chairman Mast and Corey Mills and Stutzman, they want a Syria that succeeds. They want al-Shara to succeed, and I think they had to realize at the moment, and of course they all I think spoke about this, is it's only going to be successful if it has that peace and stability for all citizens, including all the religious and ethnic minorities. And so I do think there was a shift that happened, and I think the U.S. still could play a huge role in pushing this government to make these kind of changes that could mean the difference between success and failure for Syria.
Right. I think that point about the human cost of these policies is really excellent and important to take note of. A lot of people, when thinking of these complicated and complex geopolitical conditions, they view them, as a game of chess, and the assumption then is, the important thing is about winning, right? And if
Mhm.
you can win, it means you're super intelligent or smart or capable. But there's, a major human cost to these policies and the way, what kind of policies are being supported and how, things unfold on the ground. As my final question, in light of everything, that we have seen in Syria and the reactions and the, changing policy in the West, what role should the West, and by that I particularly mean the United States and Europe, should or can play at this moment in terms of, minority protections? Like, should minority protections be tied to normalization, reconstruction funds, and sanctions relief, even though, the sanctions have been lifted by and large, at least? What kind of leverage exists there for the West to be able to play a more constructive role in shaping a, stable but also inclusive Syria, representative Syria?
I think incentivizing positive behavior is the number one thing the international community could do. And of course, they could also do things like individual sanctions on leaders that are making choices that go against minority communities. So it could be both a carrot and a stick approach. It was disappointing to see a business deal, for energy be signed just days after they took the Northeast by force. Those are not the kind of things I think the U.S. and the West should be doing with this government to incentivize positive behavior by rewarding them with economic deals, or even having them join the coalition to defeat ISIS days after they took the Northeast by force, sent a message that it didn't really matter that they did that. Like, there was no cost for them. It just, they get to make those kind of decisions as the leaders of Syria. But that shouldn't be. We do have a say if we're going to provide support to them financially, if we're going to help set up business deals for them, if we're going to bring them into the coalition to defeat ISIS. Those are all things that they should earn. And we should use the power we have to incentivize them changing the government in order to make it more inclusive for all the minority communities. And to be honest, if they want to do that, they also need cover to do it. And I think that's a political reality that often we forget. We're not doing President al-Shara any favors by just giving him a high five and saying we support you, and then making him have to look like the bad guy as he does all of these things with a base that did not expect it. So if in fact we want him to have the space to make these changes, I think it needs to be really tough pressure on him in order to make it something that's doable politically for him. So I think we need to look at it differently. How do we support him in a way to build the kind of Syria that we need Syria to be in order to be successful, rather than we love him, we want him to be successful, and we're just going to be rooting for him from here. But then he's got this tough environment to play in. So like I said, for me, I look at the way I'm talking about this government isn't because I want to take them down. It's because I want them to be successful. And this is the path to be successful. And that is why I'm speaking out about this, and I was honored to be able to do that at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'll continue to do that in interviews like here, where we could just have those deep dives and talk it through a little bit, so people understand that this is the practical way forward for Syria, and it would be just so exciting to see them grow into what they could be. But of course, I do think that they're at a crossroads at the moment. They can go either way, and hopefully the US and the West can help push them to make those hard choices that will end up paying off in the long run for them.
That's really crucial, and nobody really wants Syria to fail. It cannot
Yeah.
afford to fail, given what the country has been through over the past 14 years and the previous decades. But it's really important, that the notion of stability and inclusion and representation of the minorities are not seen as opposite things. They can all go together, and that sort of inclusion and genuine representation contributes greatly toward the stability. With that, we are at the end of today's discussion. Before we sign off, Nadine, is there anything you'd like to leave our audiences with? Any final message or where things stand and what to watch in the weeks ahead?
Well, I think if there's an opportunity to support Syria, whether through NGOs or other groups doing work on the ground, it's important that if we're going to say we want Syria to be successful, that we help them. I think countries should be giving humanitarian aid. I mean, during this really crucial time, it's key that we support the people of Syria.
Great. Nadine, it's truly been a pleasure having you on GeoSpace and drawing on your expertise at such a pivotal moment for Syria and the broader region. For our audiences, Nadine Maenza is a leading advocate for international religious freedom and an expert on minority rights in the Middle East. And to everyone tuning in, thank you as always for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of GeoSpace. Thank you so much, Nadine. It was really great having you and have
Yeah.
this conversation together.